Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel, Godless Recovery. My name's Aaron and I'm actually no longer an alcoholic. I tried a combination of miracle mineral solution enemas and jelly juice for about the past week, and now I'm too emaciated to even think about drinking, so I guess I fixed my problem. It has fixed and changed my life. Anyways, I'll start this off with a brief recap in case you haven't seen the other episodes. In the first episode of the series, I talked about what benefit Alcoholics Anonymous can have in spite of a person's beliefs or lack of belief in any particular God. The second episode was about my own personal slow downward spiral into alcoholism before I was at a point where I had to get sober, otherwise I was going to die. The third episode was just a broad overview of the history of the 12-step program, its origins inside of a different, much more religious organization, and its evolution over its first early years in the 1940s, early 50s. So now that all that's out of the way, let's just get into it. What AA can be for a person, particularly in the early stages of recovery. And mind you, I'm mentioning AA, but there are plenty of other 12-step programs, and at the end of this I'll also mention a few of the very worthwhile secular alternatives to the 12-step program. I simply focus on this because it is the most prevalent, common, and easy to access sobriety group anywhere in the country and most places around the world. It doesn't matter where you're at, anywhere in the country, you're probably going to be able to find a 12-step meeting within driving distance. And if you're in a more densely populated area, you have a multitude of different options to be able to go to. Additionally, it's completely free of charge. You can spend some money on coffee or donating to it, but there's no obligation to be able to pay. And generally, when people have hit their bottom, they might not be in the best financial situation. So things like rehab may be completely out of the question, but beyond that, even getting in to see a therapist or getting any basic access to mental health treatment can be nigh impossible at the outset. And because those processes take so long to be able to get established, you're left in this kind of limbo where you're trying to stay sober. You've got that goal in mind, but nothing's coming together to be able to help you with that. And when you're on that edge, every hour, every day can be really challenging to stay sober minute by minute, not just day by day. So that's where the 12-step program comes in. Now, I've said this before, but I feel like it's important to mention again. There are many shortcomings with the 12-step program. There are many issues with different groups, different people inside of those groups. Sometimes the rigidity of the organization as a whole, they tend to address with a certain degree of mistrust. That's gotten better over the years because things like antidepressants and psychiatric medications have a far more well-established foothold than they did in the 40s or the 50s when this program got off the ground. But the 12-step program, the big book, all that in general, is very similar to religion in the sense that it's extremely obdurate. It does not change easily. They treat it as though it's a religious or biblical text. That altering the words inside of there, altering anything inside of it, is considered somewhat sacrilegious, I guess, would be a good way of putting it. But all these shortcomings aside, the value that you can get, particularly when you're at that bottom point where you need to get out or you're going to not be here very much longer. You know, you could be facing jail, or you have extreme health issues, or you've lost most, if not all, the important people in your life. That's a point where you need to get sober, and yet it's also the most difficult point to get your shit together enough to start that process. And that's where the 12-step program and sobriety groups like that can be extremely helpful. And the main focus at the outset is not changing what you believe, because beliefs, as I've said, are not something that you can will yourself to change. What you can change is behavior. And sometimes those adjustments to behavior over time can lead to far deeper and more fundamental changes to yourself, to your personality, to your way of addressing stresses or cravings, or essentially addressing the world around you from a perspective different from the one that you've been living in for however long you've had your problem. So, if you've decided that you're at that point and need to get some help, the first step is to just start going to meetings. I'll link below. There's a national AA Alliance website that lists all the meetings anywhere in the country, any point in time. So if you just pick a day, an area, it'll give you the closest meetings and the times for them. Some are women's meetings, some are in Spanish, some are LGBT friendly / focused, some are focused on mental health issues. There's a strong myriad of different opportunities available. For example, I'm in Colorado, and in downtown Denver, there's an old historic building right downtown that was donated to AA and has been hosting meetings for, I'm thinking, the past 30 years, and at least 20 years it's been there. And they have dozens of meetings every single day. Now, that place, like many other meeting locations, has its shortcomings and it has its benefits. But when you're at that really low point and are struggling, not necessarily just day by day, but hour by hour to stay sober, you do have opportunities to be able to get to these. And at the very beginning, when you're trying to stay sober and at the same time detox from your habit, just immersing yourself in that environment religiously is a very valuable way of just keeping yourself away from spiraling down day by day as you start to pull away from that mess that was your life up until that point. Now, when I say religious, I'm definitely not talking about any particular religion or any type of spirituality. I'm speaking about religious as in the same way that a person brushes their teeth religiously, or tracks their favorite sport or TV show religiously. At the earliest points in recovery, at that early stage, it's extremely valuable and generally fairly critical to keep yourself as religious about focusing on your sobriety as possible. To always keep that at the forefront of your mind, because it's going to be the most central part of your life for however long it takes for you to be able to start dealing with life outside of just dealing with your sobriety. There are a few key factors that can be critical to making sure that you don't fall off the wagon or come apart early on at that point when the physical addiction is so central to what you're experiencing and what you're struggling through at that time. No matter what the substance is, you will probably be going through withdrawals at the early outset. If it's something radical, absolutely seek medical attention, particularly if you're a severe alcoholic or a severe opiate addict. Sometimes going off of those just cold turkey can be not only dangerous but fatal. And if you go into a medical setting and let them know that that's what you're trying to go away from, most will try and work with you. For alcoholics, it's often they're put on benzodiazepines for at least a short period of time to make sure that the detox process isn't too extreme. With opiates, it depends, and they're obviously going to not give you any painkillers or anything like that, thank God, but there are a few different chemical options to be able to minimize the effects of withdrawal. So definitely seek that out, because it makes the process far less painful on a physical level, which helps you just focus on the process of getting away from that habit overall. When approaching your sobriety religiously, no gods are required. No belief in God is required. None of that is something that you're just going to overnight tell yourself exists or have a sudden spiritual epiphany that'll make you completely change your belief structure overnight or over the course of a year or a decade. Often in situations like that, your beliefs are the last thing to change, and the first thing that's going to have to change is your behavior. So for me personally, when I had first gotten sober, I went to meetings every day, and I went to a wide variety of meetings all over the place, trying to find one that fit for me. Each one of the meetings that you go to, there are going to be a number of regulars there, a lot of old timers that have been sober for a long time and still go to meetings on a regular basis. And each one's going to have its own feel, so to speak. And whether or not you find the meeting resonates with you can often give you a good indicator of where you should try and go when you're able to. Now, obviously, if the group that you find the strongest connection with only meets once a week, then that's probably not going to be enough in early sobriety. But for the first 90 days, consider it a shopping experience, so to speak. Try and just check out as many different meetings as you can to see where you feel you fit best. So that way, once you do find those ones, you have certain places to fall back onto and go to on a regular basis and build up a network of people with the same problem as you who are willing to work with you on what you're struggling with. Now, with that, I'm not going into the 12 steps in detail, but a big portion of it is passing on the quote-unquote gift to other alcoholics and their struggles. So no matter what meeting you go to, generally speaking, there are going to be people there interested in trying to help you, trying to see what they can do to help you stick around. So when you first go to meetings, there are certain things that are asked kind of at the beginning, including, is this your first, second, or third meeting since your last drink? Are there any newcomers, any birthdays, meaning years of sobriety? Early on, I know it can be incredibly uncomfortable, but try and speak up. If you are a newcomer, say it, raise your hand and let them know. If it is your first, second, or third meeting, or your 5th, or your 10th, let them know that you're early on in this. Many other members of the group will try and take those cues and not necessarily obsessively pay too much attention to you, but they will start focusing on you. But they will more than likely reach out to you and try and communicate with you a bit more proactively than if you're just another anonymous face in the meeting. Now, I'm an extreme introvert, so that was definitely a difficult thing to do, but it's extremely valuable, not because you're necessarily trying to make a bunch of new friends or anything like that, but because every person in that room had a first day, a first week, a first month when they were in there. And almost all of them, as far as I've ever seen, recognize how hard those early times are. So they will try and reach out to you and both give you advice and offer you an ear to be able to listen to what you're struggling with and try and help you as much as they're capable of. Now, again, every meeting's different, and there's certainly a lot of shitty sober people out there, same as there are a lot of shitty people that still have their habits. But when you're in the earliest stages of getting sober, again, your religion has to be your sobriety, and that's first and forefront inside of your mind, because if it's not, then it's easy to slip. And if you slip, generally if you've got a really bad habit, the slip is going to be a fucking train wreck every single time. Now, for this next part, I find that it's much more reasonable to just quote the person that made the brilliant insight rather than try and butcher the meaning of that insight by mangling it up with my own language. The following is an excerpt from George Berkeley's work called, A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge. This particular excerpt, I think, is very fitting to the general struggle that a person who considers himself to be fairly skeptical faces when they're dealing with something that on a rational level doesn't really easily make sense. So here it is.
Philosophy being nothing else but the study of wisdom and truth, it may with reason be expected that those who have spent most time and pains in it should enjoy a greater calm and serenity of mind, a greater clearness and evidence of knowledge, and be less disturbed with doubts and difficulties than other men. Yet so it is, we see the illiterate bulk of mankind that walk the high road of plain common sense, and are governed by the dictates of nature, for the most part easy and undisturbed. To them nothing that is familiar appears unaccountable or difficult to comprehend. They complain not of any want of evidence in their senses, and are out of all danger of becoming sceptics. But no sooner do we depart from sense and instinct to follow the light of a superior principle, to reason, meditate, and reflect on the nature of things, but 1,000 scruples spring up in our minds concerning those things which before we seemed fully to comprehend. Prejudices and errors of sense do from all parts discover themselves to our view, and endeavouring to correct these by reason, we are insensibly drawn into uncouth paradoxes, difficulties, and inconsistencies, which multiply and grow upon us as we advance in speculation, till at length, having wandered through many intricate mazes, we find ourselves just where we were, or, which is worse, sit down in a forlorn scepticism.
Now from that, I'll just briefly mention a line that I've heard many times in meetings, and that is that you can't be too dumb for AA, but you can be too smart for it. And although I don't consider myself to be all that exceptionally intelligent by any means, the underlying issue definitely resonates with me. As you heard in the excerpt from Berkeley, there is truth to the saying that ignorance is bliss. That if you simply believe in something and work off of that premise, you can find the fruits of that labor without even concerning yourself with the hows and the whys that it works the way that it does. However, if you're naturally curious or naturally skeptical about things that tend to have such heavy religious or ethereal connotations to it, it's hard to invest yourself into a program whose overarching narrative is something that you don't really entirely agree with or think is entirely accurate or effective. And AA is a perfect example of that. There are many aspects of how it deals with addiction and recovery that are frankly archaic. They're things that seem to be really innovative and revolutionary for the 40s and 50s, and yet, especially over the past 2 or 3 decades, it's becoming clearer and clearer that science is finally catching up with some of the metaphysical woo that you find inside of the 12 steps, inside of AA meetings, and their focus on transcendent spiritual awakening, so to speak. So the reason why I put that in here is simply to say that particularly in the early stages, don't try and overthink it. Don't try and be overly critical of it. Because generally speaking, investing yourself into something that's not true is generally not a good idea. I mean, I invested myself into the truth of chili juice, and I spent 4 days on the toilet. So yeah, it can be more harmful than good. And no, I didn't really take chili juice. I just find that to be the most entertaining woo that I've come across in the past couple months. So even though I am saying don't overthink it necessarily, simply focus on going to meetings, connecting with other people there, just to be open in meetings, express yourself, keep going to the meetings, listen, and don't drink between meetings. And even if you think that the overall program ends up not being something for you, it can really help you get through that first 30, 60, 90 days, or the first year. That first really heavy time when your life is radically shifting. A lot of the shit that you've been able to push away because of your habit comes roaring back into your life, and you no longer have your favorite tool to be able to cope with that type of shit. And it doesn't matter what the shit may be, whether it's family issues, legal issues, personal issues from 40 years ago. that stuff starts coming back once you get sober. And the thing that you use to push away from that for however many decades you've been able to, it's going to come rushing back too. Now, with all that being said, one piece of advice that you'll hear quite often inside of the 12-step program is that you need to find your higher power. They'll usually not call it God, but yeah, they're always asking you to find your higher power. And it's understandable because that's one of the things that's been central to AA since the outset. The recommendation that I would give to a person that's early on in their sobriety and keeps on hearing that they need to find their higher power is to simply find one that you don't have to attribute the term God to. They'll probably attribute it to God. You'll hear God countless times in any meeting that you go to. Every time they refer to that, it's the higher power, same thing that they're talking about. But if you don't believe in the nonsense of it being some supernatural, transcendent, eternal being that actually gives a damn about your individual life, that's fine. A lot of people who are generally irreligious that come into the 12 steps tend to find some other, much more concrete thing to be their higher power. And one of the easiest ones to be able to utilize at that point is the group as a whole, the 12-step program as a whole. That even though it's not something you can necessarily pray to or give your will and your life over to, so to speak, it's a place that you can go to and fall back to when you're struggling with your own personal issues and the cravings that might make you want to go back out again. It's kind of like when Christians are in a spiritual crisis, as they may put it. A lot of times the recommendation to them is to just go to church and to pray. And in the early stages of your sobriety, the AA groups can be a very useful church. I've been sober for just shy of 4 years now, and although I do go to meetings on occasion, I no longer have a home group. I've gone through the 12 steps, and I don't attend meetings other than when I've had a particularly difficult time and feel like, or just have the general sense that it's time to go in and deal with some stuff. But at the outset, especially the first year, I was there, well, during the first 3 months, I was there every single day, while also keeping a full-time job. And after that point, I was still there at least 2 or 3 times a week for quite a long time, because it was useful to just keep myself centered around my sobriety, keep myself honest with what I'm dealing with and what I'm struggling with, and to keep me around other alcoholics as sort of a sounding board. Hearing their stories, hearing what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and being able to speak about what I may be struggling with is all a very helpful environment to keep yourself close to, regardless of what your personal beliefs may be on any particular supernatural being or natural being. Something that you don't even need to begin touching on at the earliest stages. The first thing that you need to be doing is simply staying sober. If you can do that and keep that going, then you're already well on your way to being able to live sober, which is a slightly different thing. So the next part that I'm going to be getting into is on the issue of honesty and the role of God, big G God, in the 12 steps, and how to look at the 12 steps without incorporating God into that, if that's not something that you believe in. To show you a way that the 12 steps can be presented without any inclusion of God in there whatsoever, and still have it be just as compelling and effective towards the process as it is with a God inside of it. That's a long topic to be able to explain in detail, so I think I've talked enough for this episode. Besides, I finished my last dose of jelly juice about 45 minutes ago, and if I don't get to a toilet in like 3 minutes, I'm going to die. I'm Godless Recovery, and I guess I'll see you all next time.